The ambush happened so fast that Lieutenant Jake Carter barely had time to register what was going on before he found himself face down on the cold metal floor of an alien warship. One moment, he was piloting a small supply transport through the Outer Rim; the next, his ship was surrounded by the jagged, black-armored vessels of the Vargan mercenaries. He had heard stories about them, brutal, efficient, and ruthless in their dealings. The Vargan were known for attacking defenseless transports, looting whatever they could, and either ransoming or killing the crew. Carter wasn't exactly defenseless, but against a dozen well-armed alien mercs, he was smart enough to know the odds weren't in his favor. His ship's shields had lasted all of 5 seconds before they were overloaded, and as his console sparked and smoked, he had barely managed to trigger the emergency distress beacon before the entire thing shut down. The airlock had been blasted open, and the next thing he knew, he was staring down the barrel of a plasma rifle held by an 8-foot-tall Vargan with an extra set of arms. They hauled him aboard their ship like a sack of cargo, stripping him of his weapons and gear before throwing him into a holding cell. The steel bars hummed with energy, definitely not something he wanted to touch. As he leaned back against the wall, rubbing his wrists where the cuffs had been, he couldn't help but notice how casual the mercenaries were acting. He wasn't blind to how dangerous the Vargan were, but they clearly thought very little of him. That was their first mistake. The interrogation chamber was just as cliché as Carter expected: dim lighting, a single chair in the center of the room, and a massive, armored alien looming over him. Korak, the Vargan leader, regarded him with the kind of expression one might give an insect before squashing it. His mandibles clicked in amusement as he circled Carter, arms folded across his broad chest. "You are a soldier of Earth," Korak rumbled. "You will tell us about your planet's defenses." Carter yawned. "Wow, straight to the point. No villain monologue? No threats about what happens if I don't cooperate?" Korak's second-in-command, a leaner but just as intimidating alien named Vrax, narrowed his black, reptilian eyes. "Your people are weak. Your technology is primitive. There is no need for ceremony." Carter smirked. "If we're so weak, why are you bothering to interrogate me?" Korak's nostrils flared, but he didn't respond. Instead, he pulled up a holographic display, showing various images of Earth's fleet. "You will tell us how many ships patrol your colonies. What weaknesses do they have? Which stations are the most vulnerable?" Carter tilted his head. "You really think I'd just hand that over?" Vrax grinned, revealing a row of sharp teeth. "You will when we begin the real interrogation." Carter sighed dramatically. "Oh no. Not the real interrogation. What's next? Tickling? Bad cop, worse cop?" Korak's patience was running thin, evident by the way his claws flexed. He gestured for one of the guards to activate some sort of device on the wall, and the energy in the room shifted, a low hum that made the hairs on Carter's arms stand up. Pain lanced through his body, sharp and sudden, as though his nerves had been lit on fire. He gritted his teeth, but even as the pain shot through him, he refused to give them the satisfaction of a scream. It lasted only a few seconds before Korak signaled for it to stop. "Tell us what we want to know, human." Carter exhaled through his nose, shaking off the lingering pain. All right. He leaned forward conspiratorially, lowering his voice. "There's something important you should know." Korak leaned in slightly. Carter grinned. "Your breath stinks." Vrax growled, raising his fist, but Korak held up a hand, stopping him. The leader of the Vargan exhaled slowly, studying Carter in a new light. "You are either very brave," he said, "or very foolish." Bit of both." Vrax, clearly losing his patience, turned to one of the other mercenaries. "Check his records. If he is a low-level soldier, he is useless to us. If he has value, we will decide his fate accordingly." Korak nodded. "Do it." Vrax took a datapad and began scanning through the military files they had pulled from Carter's ship. The mercenary wasn't expecting much. Humans were barely considered a threat on a galactic scale. They had decent weapons, sure, but nothing compared to the war-forged empires of the Outer Rim. But then his expression shifted. His brow furrowed, mandibles twitching as he struggled to process what he was seeing. The translator struggled with some of the words, but one stood out, glowing ominously on the screen. Reaper. Silence fell over the room. Vrax swallowed hard, his fingers tightening around the datapad. Korak noticed the change in demeanor immediately. What is it? Vrax hesitated. His call sign. It is Reaper. The shift in the room was immediate. One of the guards took an unconscious step back. Another muttered something in the Vargan tongue, a curse, most likely. Korak's eyes narrowed as he turned back to Carter, whose smirk had only grown wider. I see you've heard of me, Carter said casually. Korak's grip on his armrest tightened. You are that Reaper? Carter just leaned back, completely relaxed. That depends. What exactly have you heard? Korak's jaw clenched, and he gestured for Vrax to continue. The second in command hesitated before reading out loud. Lieutenant Jake Carter. Callsign Reaper. Specialist in high-risk infiltration, guerrilla warfare, and counterintelligence. Single-handedly neutralized the Shakthal warlord's command fleet. Led the successful raid on the Orion Syndicate's stronghold. Dispatched entire mercenary units without leaving a trace. The list went on. Each accomplishment more unbelievable than the last. And yet, the Vargan had no reason to believe it was anything but the truth. Carter watched as the weight of the realization settled over them. The moment of confidence they had held over him shattered in an instant, replaced by a growing, palpable fear. He stretched his arms and cracked his knuckles. So, what happens now? The room remained eerily silent as the weight of Carter's name settled over the mercenaries like a death shroud. No one spoke. No one moved. Even the ship's ever-present hum felt quieter, as if the metal itself had tensed at the revelation. Korak's normally confident demeanor was shaken, though he did his best to mask it. His jaw was tight, his four hands flexing unconsciously. Vrax, however, made no effort to hide his growing unease. His hands trembled slightly as he clutched the datapad, his reptilian eyes darting between Carter and Korak, as if waiting for confirmation that this was all a terrible mistake. The Reaper, Korak finally muttered, as if saying the name aloud made it real. We thought you were a myth. Carter tilted his head slightly, as if considering it. Some say I am. Another long silence stretched between them before Korak turned to Vrax. Verify this. Now. Vrax hesitated before tapping rapidly on the datapad. It didn't take long for the information to cross-reference with confirmed battle reports. The data didn't just support the legend, it solidified it. Confirmed, Vrax murmured. The Human Alliance classified most of his records, but we have enough to verify his reputation. Reputation? That word barely scratched the surface of the kind of stories that surrounded Carter. To some, he was a soldier. To others, he was a ghost. And to many, he was the whispered nightmare that made even hardened killers hesitate before engaging with humans. Korak let out a slow, measured breath. You single-handedly dismantled the Shakthal fleet? Carter shrugged. I had a little help. Mostly from their own stupidity. You infiltrated the Orion Syndicate's stronghold and wiped out their leadership in a single night. They were rude. You survived the Battle of Traxxas III. Alone. That one was a rough day, Carter admitted. Korak clenched his jaw tighter, the tension thickening in the room. Carter smiled. You know, I don't mind being underestimated, but you might want to work on your intel before kidnapping someone. A murmur rippled through the mercenaries. A few shifted uneasily. One outright left the room. Carter leaned forward, resting his elbows on the metal table in front of him. So, what's the plan now, fellas? Korak didn't answer immediately. He was too busy weighing his options. They had brought this human aboard under the assumption that he was just another weak soldier, one they could either ransom or execute as a message to Earth. But now they were locked in a ship with him. The tension only worsened as words spread through the crew. In the dimly lit corridors, mercenaries whispered amongst themselves, trying to make sense of the situation. Many had heard the stories. The Reaper was the kind of name that got spoken in hushed voices in back alley bars, always with a sense of skepticism, as if saying it too loudly might summon him. But no one had ever thought they'd actually come face to face with the man. Some of the younger mercenaries scoffed, saying it was all exaggerated, that he was just a human, flesh and blood like any other. But the veterans, the ones who had fought in wars and seen what Carter had done firsthand, weren't so sure. One particularly bold warrior, Sark, snorted as he leaned against the mess hall table. "It's just a name," he grumbled. "We're Vargan. We don't bow to ghost stories." An older mercenary, Rillick, narrowed his eyes. "You ever seen a fleet of warships disappear without a trace, Sark?" Sark scoffed. "There's always an explanation." Rillick leaned in, voice low. "Yeah. Him." The mess hall fell silent. The younger ones exchanged glances, suddenly less sure of themselves. Meanwhile, Carter remained in his cell, perfectly calm. He stretched his legs out in front of him, yawning. The guards standing outside his door kept a nervous distance, as if expecting him to break free at any moment. "You know," Carter called out to them, "if you're that scared, you could always just let me go." Neither guard answered. But one did tighten his grip on his weapon. The ship was already on edge. Carter decided to push it further. The next morning, at least, what counted as morning in space, he made a point of appearing completely at ease. When a mercenary delivered his food tray, he took his time eating, critiquing the quality as if he were a customer at a restaurant. "Little bland," he said between bites. "But hey, points for presentation." The mercenary said nothing, simply leaving as quickly as possible. Later, when Korik and Vrax came to check on him, Carter leaned against the wall, tossing a small metal object between his hands. "Here's the thing," he said casually. "I don't actually want to cause problems. I'd rather not kill all of you. But if I have to..." He caught the object midair, smiling. "Well, you know how it goes." Korik's eyes darkened. "Enough. We are deciding what to do with you." "Oh, take your time." Carter stretched. "I'm in no rush." Vrax shifted uneasily. "We could still execute him." Carter snorted. "Yeah, good luck with that." Korik exhaled sharply, clearly losing patience. "Put him in a secure cell. Make sure it is far from the weapons bay." Vrax nodded, barking orders to the guards. As they moved Carter, they kept their weapons trained on him the entire time. Carter, for his part, looked thoroughly unimpressed. As the energy bars of his new cell activated, he leaned back with a satisfied grin. He wasn't locked in there with them. They were locked in there with him. It started small. A flickering light in the hallway outside Carter's cell. A sudden drop in temperature in the mess hall. The ship's artificial gravity fluctuated for just a second, barely enough to notice, but enough to unnerve the already jittery crew. At first, no one thought much of it. Malfunctions happened. Even a well-maintained warship had occasional glitches. But then, the glitches kept happening. The main doors to the cargo bay locked and refused to open for over an hour. The weapons lockers registered as empty despite being fully stocked. And the security cameras in Carter's cell? They cut out every few minutes before flickering back to life, always showing him in the exact same position, as if he hadn't moved at all. By the end of the first day, the crew wasn't just uneasy, they were terrified. Vrax was the first to voice what others were thinking. "It's him," he whispered to Korik, barely able to conceal the fear in his voice. "He's doing something." Korik shot him a glare. "He's locked in a high-security cell. And yet things are still going wrong." Korik didn't respond. He didn't want to admit it, but the entire situation was making his skin crawl. He had been in countless battles, faced death more times than he could count, but this? This was different. This wasn't a fight. This was a ghost in their midst, unraveling them one frayed nerve at a time. They sent 2 guards to monitor Carter directly, standing at attention just outside his cell. But hours passed, and he did nothing. He just sat there, leaning against the wall, occasionally whistling a slow, eerie tune that none of them recognized. And yet, the ship continued to break down around them. The next morning, Vrax stormed into the command deck, eyes wild. 3 of our crew have refused to leave their quarters, he reported. They say they're sick. Sick? Korik asked, skeptical. Vrax hesitated. They say it's fear. Korik slammed a fist on the table. Enough. This is nonsense. He is one man. Vrax wasn't convinced. One man. The man. Korik didn't respond. He couldn't. Then came the real incidents. During a routine systems check, the ship's automated defenses activated against their own crew. It was brief, only a few seconds, but it was enough for a gun turret to fire a warning shot down the hallway, sending mercenaries diving for cover. The weapons bay sealed itself moments later, and no one could access it. In the barracks, a mercenary swore he saw a shadow move when no one was there. Another claimed he heard his name whispered through the comms, but when they checked the logs, no one had sent the transmission. The fear spread like wildfire. They tried to blame the ship's AI. But the AI, when asked, simply responded with, "All systems are functioning within expected parameters," which only made things worse. Finally, they sent a small squad to investigate Carter's cell, just to make sure he hadn't somehow escaped. He was still there, sitting against the wall, smirking. One of the younger mercenaries stepped forward, gripping his weapon tightly. "What are you doing?" he demanded. Carter raised an eyebrow. "Sitting. You're behind this." Carter tilted his head. "Am I?" The lights flickered overhead. The young mercenary took a step back. Carter grinned wider. "Boo!" The mercenary bolted. The others weren't far behind. The breaking point came when Korik made the decision to kill him. He had resisted it at first. Not out of mercy, but because he feared what might happen if they failed. But now, his crew was on the verge of mutiny. If he didn't take action, the entire ship would tear itself apart from paranoia alone. They would space him. It was the simplest solution. No dramatic executions, no drawn-out fights. Just open the airlock and let the vacuum of space do the work. They didn't even bother restraining him as they pulled him from the cell. 4 mercenaries surrounded him, weapons raised, though their hands were unsteady. Korik himself led the march to the airlock, jaw clenched, every step filled with determination. Carter walked calmly. That unsettled them most of all. They reached the airlock, the massive metal door groaning as it slid open to reveal the dark abyss beyond. Korik stepped forward, meeting Carter's gaze. "Any last words, Reaper?" Carter smiled. "You sure you want to do this?" Korik's expression darkened. "I don't want to. But I must." Carter's grin didn't fade. "Then I'd start running." Korik frowned. "What?" And then, explosions. The ship lurched violently as fire and smoke erupted from multiple decks. Emergency sirens blared, red lights flashing across the walls. The mercenaries stumbled, some falling to their knees. Carter remained standing. Korik's communicator crackled to life with frantic voices. "Engineering is compromised. Main power is failing. Shields are down. We're under attack. No, wait, the ship is attacking itself." Korik turned back to Carter, a mix of rage and disbelief in his eyes. "What did you do?" Carter simply stepped forward, clapping Korik on the shoulder. "Looks like someone's on my side." And with that, he strolled out of the airlock, untouched, as chaos erupted around him. The ship was in utter chaos. Smoke filled the corridors, alarms blared through every deck, and emergency sirens cast an eerie red glow over the metallic walls. The Vargan mercenaries scrambled in every direction, shouting over one another as they tried to make sense of what was happening. Carter walked calmly down the corridor. He moved with the ease of a man who had already won the fight before it even began. He had no armor, no weapon, not even a plan. But he didn't need one. The mercenaries had already defeated themselves. They just didn't know it yet. A group of 3 warriors rounded the corner ahead, weapons raised. Their hands were shaking. Carter could hear the hesitation in their breathing, see the fear in their widened eyes. They had been trained for war. For firefights. For direct, brutal combat. But not for this. Carter raised his hands in mock surrender. "Gentlemen," he greeted casually. One of them twitched, finger hovering over the trigger. Carter sighed. "Come on now. You're not really gonna shoot me, are you?" The lead mercenary swallowed. "Stay back." "Or what?" Carter asked. "You shoot me, maybe I die. Maybe I don't. Maybe I get back up and finish what I started." He took a slow step forward. "Or maybe I was never really here at all." The lights flickered. It was just a minor electrical fluctuation, a brief dimming of the overhead lights, but it was enough. The mercenary panicked and fired. The shot hit nothing. Carter was already gone. One of the mercenaries let out a strangled curse, spinning around, trying to locate him. But Carter was already moving through the shadows, disappearing into the thick smoke pouring from a damaged vent. By the time they realized what had happened, it was too late. The game had already begun. Korik sealed himself in the command deck, sweat beading on his reptilian brow. He had fought in wars. Led planetary raids. He had never once feared a single man. But this wasn't a man. This was a force. A shadow slipping through the cracks of reality itself. He turned to Vrax, who was frantically pulling up security feeds. "Where is he?" Korik demanded. Vrax gritted his teeth. "We don't know. He was heading toward the weapons bay, but then, nothing. It's like he vanished." Korik snarled, slamming a fist onto the console. "He's playing games with us. He's hunting us," Vrax corrected. Korik exhaled sharply. "We have the numbers. We have the firepower. We end this." He activated the ship-wide comms. His voice, rough and commanding, echoed through every corridor. "Enough of this fear. He is one man. A human. We are Vargan. We fight, we kill, we conquer. If you see him, shoot to kill." For a moment, there was silence. Then, the ship's intercom crackled to life again. But it wasn't Korik speaking. It was Carter. "Nice speech, boss." Carter's voice drawled, casual and amused. "Real inspiring. Really gets the troops fired up." Korik's blood ran cold. "Problem is," Carter continued, "they don't really believe it, do they? See, the way I see it, you're running out of options. Your crew is scared, your ship is falling apart, and I'm still here." A pause. "So tell me, Korik, what happens now?" Static filled the comms. Korik's hands curled into fists. He had no answer. The crew was losing their minds. They fired at shadows, jumped at sounds. The ship felt haunted, as if Carter had become something more than just a soldier. More than just a man. They barricaded themselves in different sections of the ship, hoping to outlast whatever nightmare they had awakened. But it didn't matter. Carter was everywhere and nowhere all at once. Korik sat in the command deck, watching the chaos unfold on the remaining security feeds. He knew what was happening. Carter wasn't just fighting them. He was breaking them. And it was working. Vrax stumbled forward, breathless. "Half the crew is refusing to fight. Some are trying to get to the escape pods." "Cowards," Korik growled. "They think we're already dead, Korik," Vrax snapped. "They think he's already won." Korik slammed his fist onto the console. "Fine," he spat. "We give him what he wants." Vrax hesitated. "You mean?" Korik took a slow breath. "We let him go." Vrax looked at him like he had just suggested surrendering their entire fleet. "You want to just let him leave?" "I want him off this ship," Korik growled. "If he wants a shuttle, give him one. If he wants our cargo, let him take it. But if he stays here, we don't survive." Silence stretched between them. Then Vrax exhaled, shoulders slumping in reluctant agreement. "I'll tell the crew." Korik nodded, watching the security feed. Carter stood in the middle of an empty hallway, hands in his pockets, staring directly into the nearest camera. And he was smiling. The command deck doors opened with a hiss, and Carter strolled in like he owned the place. Korik sat rigidly in his chair, muscles tense. Vrax stood nearby, hand hovering over his sidearm, though they all knew he wouldn't use it. Carter took a moment to glance around, then whistled. Cozy setup. Korik didn't move. You win. Carter raised an eyebrow. That easy, huh? Korik exhaled sharply. Take a shuttle and go. Carter tapped his chin, as if considering. Then he smiled. See? That's the smartest decision you've made all day. Korik clenched his jaw. Just leave. Carter turned to head toward the shuttle bay but stopped just before the door. He looked back over his shoulder. Oh, and Korik? The Vargan leader stiffened. Carter grinned. Next time, do your homework before you kidnap someone. Then he was gone. Korik let out a slow breath and finally, for the first time since the nightmare began, relaxed. He wasn't sure what scared him more, the fact that he had let Carter go, or the fact that he knew they would never, ever try to take a human hostage again. The shuttle's engines hummed as Carter leaned back in the pilot's seat, hands resting casually on the controls. The ship's autopilot was locked in, set for the nearest human Alliance outpost. Through the viewport, the Vargan warship grew smaller and smaller in the distance, drifting in the cold black of space. Carter let out a low chuckle. They'd learn from this. They'd tell others. The Reaper wasn't someone to mess with. That little myth about him? It had just grown 10 times larger. Somewhere in the galaxy, mercenary captains, pirate lords, and warlords would hear what happened on that ship. Some would laugh. Some wouldn't believe it. But those who knew, those who understood what fear could do, would think twice before tangling with a human ever again. He kicked his feet up on the console and stretched, letting the silence settle in. It was always amusing to watch people unravel. The Vargan had been so confident, so sure of their own superiority. They didn't understand that the worst battles weren't fought with guns or blades. They were fought in the mind. And Carter had won that war without even firing a single shot. The moment Carter's shuttle docked at the Human Alliance outpost, the station went into a frenzy. The crew had already picked up the automated distress beacon from his downed supply ship and assumed he was dead or captured. When the doors to the docking bay hissed open and Carter strolled in like he'd just come back from a casual vacation, jaws dropped. An officer rushed toward him. Lieutenant Carter, sir! We thought. Yeah, Carter interrupted, waving a hand. I know. I'm alive. Surprise. A small crowd gathered, some whispering in hushed tones. The rumor mill worked fast in the Alliance, and Carter's name carried weight. Officers exchanged glances. Soldiers muttered to one another. Is it true? One finally asked. Did you take down an entire Vargan ship? Carter smirked. That depends. How much of the story have you heard? Enough. Another officer muttered. A superior officer finally arrived, Commander Briggs, a no-nonsense leader who had worked with Carter before. He gave him a long, knowing look before jerking his head toward his office. Carter. My office. Now. Carter sighed. See, this is why I didn't want to come back right away. Briggs wasn't amused. Move. Inside the office, Briggs shut the door and folded his arms. The hell happened out there? Carter leaned back in the chair across from him. Long story short? Vargan mercs took me hostage. Then they let me go. Briggs frowned. Just like that? Carter shrugged. Well, they thought they were taking a standard soldier. Turns out, I wasn't what they expected. Briggs stared at him. You really didn't kill anyone? Didn't have to. Briggs exhaled, shaking his head in disbelief. You really are something else, Carter. Carter grinned. That's what they keep telling me. Briggs tapped his fingers against his desk. Well, whatever you did, it's got the brass interested. There's talk of putting you on special assignments, black ops, deep cover missions. Carter made a face. Sounds like a lot of work. You're getting a raise. Carter perked up. You should have led with that. Briggs sighed. Go get some rest. And for the love of God, don't cause any more intergalactic incidents for at least a week. No promises, Carter said, standing. Word of what happened on the Vargan ship spread fast. Within days, reports popped up in mercenary networks, crime syndicate channels, and deep space black markets. The message was clear. The Reaper is real. The Reaper is untouchable. And if you value your life, don't mess with him. The Vargan themselves took drastic measures. The mercenary fleet that had captured Carter? They went completely silent, refusing to take contracts against humans. Some even left the crew, choosing exile over the risk of ever facing him again. It was amusing, really. Carter hadn't fired a single bullet. Hadn't laid a hand on them. And yet he had crippled them far worse than any battle ever could. He was back on the outpost when he received a secure message. No name. No sender ID. Just a short, simple transmission. Let's not meet again, Reaper. Carter laughed. Message received. A week later, Carter was in the station's bar, sipping on a well-earned drink, when a junior officer hesitantly approached. Sir? The young man asked. Is it true you took down the Vargan warship by yourself? Carter smirked. Who told you that? Everyone. He swirled his drink. And what do you think? The officer hesitated. I think I'd rather not know. Carter grinned. Smart answer. The officer saluted and hurried away. Carter leaned back, savoring the moment. Reputation was a funny thing. He took a slow sip of his drink, listening to the murmurs of his name ripple through the room. It didn't matter what was true anymore. All that mattered was that no one would ever take him lightly again.